ushering me on, so I go start. Can I start? Yeah. Okay. Good evening and welcome to Coil Ridge Books. We are hosting an event tonight which is being taped for C-SPAN, so welcome to C-SPAN. This is Book TV. Swindlers, hucksters, American history is rife with those out to deceive. Where is the line between aggressive business people and out-and-out con men? To answer this question and more, Edward Balleisen is here to share his new book, Fraud, An American History from Barnum to Madoff. The Associate Professor of History and Senior Fellow in the Keenan Institute for Ethics at Duke University documents the relationship between deregulation and rises in fraud. Is what's good for business always good for consumers? We're going to introduce tonight NC State History Chair, Department Chair David Zonderman, who will further introduce our guests, and I would like to turn it over to him at this moment.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. As was said, I'm David Zonderman. I'm head of the History Department at NC State University. And first of all, I want to thank Ed for asking me to moderate this panel. I'm really looking forward to it. Ed has already been introduced to you. He is a member of the faculty History Department at Duke University. He's also Duke's Vice Provost for Interdisciplinary Studies, where he's currently leading a major project funded by the National Endowment for Humanities, at least as long as it lasts, on exploring new careers for humanities PhDs. And as the father of a soon-to-be, I hope, PhD in the humanities, I have great interest in that because he certainly wants to explore career opportunities. Let me introduce the rest of the panel, starting from Ed's left back toward me. Next to Ed is Kevin Anderson, who is currently the Senior Deputy Attorney General for the state of North Carolina. He also heads the Consumer Protection Division, and he's been directing that for the past 5 years. He's been lead attorney on a wide range of cases and investigations involving financial fraud, healthcare, telecommunications, and internet issues. And he's also argued many cases before the North Carolina Supreme Court. And next to me is former Congressman Brad Miller from the 13th District, or what once was the 13th District, before it was gerrymandered into all kinds of different shapes and places. Mr. Miller represented the 13th District from 2003 to 2012. He earned his bachelor's degree from Chapel Hill, a master's degree from the London School of Economics, and a law degree from Columbia University. He also served as a law clerk to Judge J. Dickinson Phillips on the U.S. Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, which sits in Virginia, and he's been practicing law here in North Carolina for 20 years and more. We're going to start off with Ed making just a couple of remarks about the book he has written, which I will say is all for sale, and Ed will be happy to sign copies at the end. We'll put in that shameless plug. And then we're going to turn it over to our panel to make some comments, and we'll also leave plenty of time for audience questions and answers as well. So I'll turn it over to Ed.
Thanks so much, David. So this book that I've written is about business fraud in the United States from the early 19th century right up to 2016. And it's filled with individual stories. There are lots of stories of specific business frauds, dodgy stock promoters, marketing scamsters in the consumer marketplace. It's also filled with stories about how difficult it is in many contexts to distinguish outright fraud from enthusiastic promotion, puffery, exaggeration. Nice example of that is the case of the Sears Roebuck Company, which all of you are familiar with. But you might not be familiar with it if the post office had shut it down in 1894, as it came very close to doing as a result of allegations of deceptive practices in its marketing. The book also provides a great number of stories, and this is really the key theme of the book, about responses to the problem of commercial deception, financial deception by Americans. Some of those responses are really market kinds of responses, the rise of accounting, the emergence of attempts to use advertising to warn people about the dangers of deception in the marketplace. Some of the stories are about NGOs, nonprofit organizations that became heavily focused on the problem of business fraud. But the lion's share of these stories are about responses by government. And I chart in the book a long arc of movement in the United States from a tendency to set policy according to the principle of caveat emptor, let the buyer beware, which was very much the baseline in the 19th century, to an expanding set of protections for consumers and investors in many different sectors of the economy that moved policy more in a direction toward caveat venditor, let the seller beware. I also chart then a pivot away back really towards caveat emptor since the 1970s, associated with broader dynamics of deregulation in many different areas of our policy making, and what the consequences of that have been. I argue that shift has gone along with a dramatic increase in the scale of fraud, a movement from the worst frauds being in the tens of millions to the billions or the tens of billions, and also a shift in the places where we find it. So that's fraud scandals in the last 30, 40 years have increasingly ensnared some of the biggest and most important corporations in our economy, whereas before that point in the mid-20th century, most frauds involved marginal firms or small, relatively small, medium-sized corporations. I've written the book for social scientists and historians, political scientists, but also the broad public, and perhaps more important than any other constituency, I've written the book for policymakers, for those who have to deal with the problem of deception in the marketplace on a daily basis. And that's why I'm so thrilled that we have Congressman Miller and Senior Deputy Attorney General Anderson with us tonight. Because I'd like to start our conversation just by inviting them to reflect on what the value of historical perspective is for policy, and particularly what they found in the book that helps them see the kinds of issues they've been grappling with for years, actually even decades, in a new light.
I'll jump in on that. One of the things that struck me about the book is that I think Ed makes the point that some of these scams have been around for a long time in their core form, that they may change on the nuances and the details may change, but the core framework of a lot of these scams has been around for a long time, and we see that in practice. Like, for instance, there are scams that, I mean, you all have probably, if you haven't received these phone calls, you probably have friends who have, where, you know, the IRS scam phone call, or the scam where someone's posing as the utilities company and they're calling and they say your power is going to be cut off unless you send them some immediate payment. And it can be by wire, it can be by prepaid card, sometimes it's an iTunes gift card. But the whole premise of the scam is creating this emergency situation and trying to get someone to quickly shoot out money somewhere. And that type of scam has been going on for a long, long time. Again, the details change, and every time there's some new event, the details may change. But it is, I think, both important and interesting to note that the core principles of some of these scams have been the same for a long time. And I think it also comes through in the book, and I can kind of confirm this through experience, that a lot of these scams are very well thought out, and there's a lot of brain power behind them, and that we all have to be wary of how much intelligence is behind some of these scams, and how some of these phishing emails that people get, where it's someone impersonating eBay, or and the logo looks exactly the same. I mean, it's not often a shoddy misrepresentation, but they do a really good job of impersonating the logo. And there's some very sophisticated hacking techniques that are used these days to breach information. So to me, that kind of comes through as well, just how we really have to be vigilant about how intelligent some of these scams are, and they target vulnerable people, whether it's elderly people or other people with some sort of vulnerabilities, and it's important that people are educated as to these scams, and it's important that we, as society, know of them, try to educate our parents or others who are vulnerable, and I think a lot of that historical perspective comes through in the book as well.
The thing that struck me is that this is not an unimportant topic, but it is treated as an unimportant topic. Fraud as a factor in the economy is hardly mentioned in economic textbooks, if mentioned at all. It's barely mentioned in any kind of political history. I know that there's the public image of academics, scholars who need to publish or perish, or they pick some incredibly obscure topic so they can be the world's foremost expert on some remarkably obscure topic. This is not that. It is not like Ed has done the definitive medical study of hiccups, so that if you're a physician and you have that rare patient who has had hiccups continuously for months and months, you can turn to Ed's work. This has been something that has affected our economy. Ed's book sets out some of the ways that it does. It undermines confidence in investors. It makes it harder to raise money, capital for legitimate business enterprises, innovative new business enterprises. It undermines consumers' confidence, so they don't, they're reluctant to borrow, they're reluctant to buy things because they're afraid that they're going to be cheated. So it is a significant factor in our economy. It's a significant factor in our history. We have just had a major financial crisis. You probably read about it. It was caused largely by fraud. It was not it was not a perfect storm. It was not, the other explanation is who could have known. It was rooted in fraud. Yes, there was a bubble, and the asset that was inflated was borrowed against, and there was a great deal of debt that had that as collateral, and when the bubble collapsed, that meant a lot of people couldn't pay their debt, and that's roughly the same thing that happened in the Great Depression with the stock market collapse. But there was rampant fraud in the mortgages themselves, in what people were told that they were getting in their mortgages, and in what investors were told when they were buying the securitized mortgages, the way that the mortgages were packaged and sold. I think someone made the point in the book, or argued in the book, that, well, of course, the banks had every incentive not to make fraudulent mortgages because they had the mortgages on their books. If they were foreclosed upon, they would lose money. No, they wouldn't. They weren't on their books. They sold those mortgages to investors, and they had very little to lose, and either from the fraudulent representations they made to the homeowners, or the fraudulent representations they made to the people who bought them. And the response, another point that Ed makes that I think has probably been continuous throughout our history, is the political power, the economic power of the bad actors not to be held accountable is probably why our nation's politics and world politics is where it is right now. There is a strong sense that there is an economic elite, there's an establishment that looks after themselves, and what's good for them is not good for most people. And that is fundamentally correct. I think the response to it is fundamentally incorrect, but that basic populist sense that the people in charge aren't helping me, and they don't care about me, they don't understand my life, they don't care about my life, that's fundamentally correct. And the same thing is happening in Europe with far right-wing populist parties. And by populist, I just mean that sense that there's an elite that isn't looking after you, isn't looking after ordinary people. So that's not an inconsequential thing. That's not a small thing. And it has been true throughout our history. I also was struck by the continuity of the arguments. I served in Congress for 10 years, but more to the point, I introduced legislation to, like academics need to pick some obscure topic. Members of Congress need to pick some obscure topic too, to make that their issue. And the issue that I was advised to take on that nobody else had taken on, that would lead me on a path to obscurity, which was okay, was subprime mortgage lending. That was in 2004. It was not seen as a career-enhancing position to take on. The folks who asked me to do it were the Center for Responsible Lending. They're based here in North Carolina, although they're now a national group, because they knew me through friends, and I was brand new, and I was on the Financial Services Committee, and they only later told me that they had first approached our then senior senator, John Edwards, about being the champion for that issue, and he said no. He was planning to run for president. He was trying to position himself as a Southern centrist. That was what everyone knew was the profile you needed to run for president, to be elected president as a Democrat. 4 years later, he did everything short of seeing the Internationale at campaign rallies to move to the left. But at the time, he was positioning himself as a Southern centrist, and he thought that this would be an issue that would not help him but would hurt him. But the arguments, so I was hearing the arguments because it's my bill. The arguments have been exactly the same over the course of our history. The arguments why not to regulate were the same in 2004 when I first introduced that bill. They were the same in 2009 and 2010 when we were working on Dodd-Frank and creating the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The arguments are the same.
Let me throw out a couple of questions, and then we can certainly open up to the audience as well. But first of all, I want to pick up on something that Kevin said, because it's historical, so it's an occupational hazard of mine. But one of the things that resonated with me was when you said the core of a lot of these scams don't change. And I think you're absolutely, I mean, one of the things I found fascinating in your book, Ed, was that some things that I thought were actually quote unquote modern, like, oh, that's only been done with the internet. You showed, actually people have been doing a version of that back in the 1830s. And in other cases where I thought, oh, that thing died out, when the automobile came in, you show the same old game that people were doing in the 1830s, they're still doing in the 2010s. So I guess I'd ask Ed or anyone else on the panel to talk a little. Can you think of a couple of examples of ones that really have, for lack of a better word, staying power, and why you think they persist? Is it just they're fleecing the same sheep all the time, or what?
Well, I'll give you one example. So one common investment fraud is the pyramid scheme, which involves wild promises of profitability and then initially delivering on those promises by taking the money that later investors put in and using that to pay off the dividends to early investors. And of course, this can't last forever, because eventually you run out of people at the bottom of the pyramid. One of the so the actual form of that is very consistent, but so is the mode of marketing. In almost all of these types of schemes, the approach is to look for some group of insiders and to have someone in that group. Almost all of the schemes are perpetrated by individuals who can expect to have trust, because they are selling this scheme to people like them who are distinct from the rest of society. So the most famous example of this, probably still, maybe Madoff is dislodging it, is the Ponzi scheme. That's why we call it a Ponzi scheme. Charles Ponzi operated this in Boston in the early 1920s, and he focused on the Italian community, which is what he came from. But the earliest example that I know is a scheme by a woman, actually, Sarah Howe, in the 1870s in Boston, and she focused on unmarried women. Bond of trust. I'm unmarried, you're unmarried, and there are Quakers who've given me resources that enable me to make good on my promises of wild investment returns. And once that then starts going, the chief marketers of the scheme, it's not advertising, it's word of mouth. And that is a pattern that has recurred right up to our time.
Yeah, I was struck by the persistence of affinity fraud, which you just mentioned without calling it that. That Ponzi marketed to Italians when Italians were very much a ethnic minority, somewhat isolated, did not feel particularly well served by the institutions of society. Even Madoff. Madoff right. Largely marketed what he was doing to Jews.
In the early phases particularly.
In the early phases particularly. But the subprime mortgage market, subprime mortgage lending was largely affinity fraud directed specifically at communities of color, African Americans. It was really lower middle class homeowners generally, but in the African American community and in the Latino community, it was mortgage brokers who looked like them. And they did not feel that they had been well served over time by traditional financial institutions, banks. Didn't trust them. And when someone came to them, and they needed to borrow money, and the only way they could really borrow money was by borrowing against their home because they did have equity in their home. When someone says, we're alike, you can't trust the people that you would otherwise have to deal with, I know this stuff, I can help you. That was a well-trod path in the history of fraud.
Yeah, and just to echo some of these things, a lot of these scams are based in some way. There's a story behind them. There's a psychological element. They're targeting people who are susceptible to certain types of scams. There's scams that try to take advantage of people's desire to hit it big, and so there's the scam where you're told you've won the sweepstakes, but you have to pay a small fee to get your winnings, and that's been around for a long time. Only now you get that from an email, on the internet, as opposed to someone in person telling you that, or a letter, right? Or there's the one that tries to prey upon people's desire to help other people. So hence the email you get from the Nigerian prince, or it might be, a new wrinkle on that scam might be a different type of prince. And again, and earlier versions of that type of story would have involved a different story with different details, but again, it's premised on trying to prey on people's desire to help other people, and it's very sad, but that's where a lot of these things come from. And related to that, and I always find this to be extremely sad and frustrating as someone who works on a daily basis in the fraud world. Some of the scams that are really disheartening, or the scams that arise, charities-related scams, whenever there's a natural disaster, such as Hurricane Matthew. And we know that these things happen in the wake of a natural disaster. We know that there will be false charities that come out trying to get people to donate money to them. So one of the first things we do is try to get the word out and try to warn people to do their research and not fall for scams like that. But those are some of the worst types of scams, I think, where people are really hit hard, they're in trouble, and then out comes a scam to try to take advantage of it and make it even worse. And again, things like that have been going on for a long time, but the details change, the technology changes, and if anything, sometimes technology makes prevalence of these scams and the difficulty fighting them even more difficult, because then it becomes harder sometimes to track down the scammer, because they might not even be in your community. They might be overseas, and the scam is being conducted over the internet or over the telephone. And so technology is great in a lot of ways, but it can make it easier for the scammers to perpetuate their scams as well.
Well, you mentioned one other pattern that has persisted, and that is a tendency to blame the victim for being incautious, for being foolish. A fool and his money is soon parted. That would never have happened to you. You should feel smug and superior, and you should not feel sympathetic to the guy who got hoodwinked because he was not careful in the way that that you would have been.
He was a sucker.
He was a sucker. You mentioned the, I think in the first chapter, the tendency to kind of, it was Barnum who kind of made himself this endearing scoundrel with his tales of how he had suckered people. But the popular culture figure that I thought of was W.C. Fields. In his 3 rules of life. Let me make sure I can get these right. Never give a sucker an even break. You can't cheat an honest man, and never smarten up a chump. And the sense that you would not have been cheated, that the person who was cheated would not have been cheated had they not been trying to get something they should have known better. They should not have tried to get and should have known better and known that they were being cheated. And it was their own fault. And that also makes them feel ashamed. People feel more ashamed of their financial circumstances than anything else. And being hoodwinked really makes people not come forward. You also point that out in the books. How few victims of fraud actually complain about it?
So this is a key element of the long-standing, centuries-old argument for caveat emptor. All of those principles for W.C. Fields are key elements of the argument that really the best public policy is to create incentives for people to look out for themselves.
Right.
Because if you protect them too much, then they won't do that. And that's really the best antidote to these types of deceptive practices is to have people wisen up and be careful and vigilant. The problem with that argument, and this is I think why we see a growth in more stringent regulatory protections for consumers and investors from the late 19th century through most of the 20th, is that in a modern capitalist society, the gaps in information between sellers and buyers are often so great that it's just a structural problem.
And what made me think of that was my experience in working on mortgages, where the argument was, well, they should have read their mortgage. They should have known what kind of mortgage they were signing. Like, who reads? You got a closing, you're handed a stack of documents like this, or these little yellow stickies to the side saying sign here, sign here, sign here. Who the hell reads their mortgages? It's like the TV ad by one of the insurance companies, like, did you read page 5? No, only lawyers do that. No, but and it's, believe me, it's much worse for mortgages. And what's the opportunity of cost of that for society if every consumer in America is reading their mortgages and their mutual fund statements and their credit card bills and all the insurance contracts and on and on.
Well, just to echo that, I read a book recently all about disclosures, and one of the authors of the book did a video on YouTube, printed up the terms and conditions from an internet company, and he printed it up physically. You know, this is something that normally you're just looking at on the internet, scrolling through and clicking, and it says you've read all the terms and conditions. He actually printed it out, and it stretched from, you know, the second or third story of the library in his building, and was, you know, numerous feet long. And again, who reads that? It's just we're all bombarded with information on a daily basis. Life is complex, and most people just don't have the time, and it's in a lot of legalese. It's hard to understand to begin with, and
so this is actually one key reason why fraud is a really hard problem to solve, because often in the last 150 years, even before that, one common response to the realization that there's a lot of deception in the marketplace is to think about disclosure regimes.
Right.
To sort of say, no, we have to make sure that when people provide information that they disclose it honestly, and that they do so in a way that enables people to reduce this gap between buyers and sellers. And yet, if that means an avalanche of information, it's actually not necessarily useful or salient.
Yeah, there's information asymmetry, but there's also an inequality of bargaining power.
Yes.
I don't care at all about a commercial lease between two multi-billion dollar corporations, or what's called a surplus lines insurance policy, something that's not routine but covers 17 factories. I mean, those are manuscript policies that are drafted between lawyers sitting across the table from each other, at least kind of metaphorically, if not literally. That's not something that's available to the rest of us. I mean, try to go in a bank with a laptop or a legal pad and say, I want to borrow money, but I don't want to use your forms. Let's work this out. Do you want to be the party to the first part? You want me to be the party to the first part? They're going to say, no, we only make loans on our forms that our lawyers drafted. So there's an enormous disparity in power as well. Seems like there was another point that I wanted to make. If I could read my notes. You can continue.
Well, let me throw it. Ed, you made a point at the beginning that I thought was worth discussing, and that is that the sort of the pattern of who's doing the fraud seems to shift, especially throughout the 20th century, from more marginal, shady, fly-by-night operators. At least that's the perception often. And maybe it's only perception, but it seems to me a lot more fraud today is committed by quote-unquote reputable corporations. Now, maybe that was always true and they were getting away with it more, but there does seem to be this sense of the fraudster 100 years ago seemed more to be the shady dealer. And now, at least the public thinks, the Fortune 500s are all out to defraud us.
Well, there are scandals and enforcement actions that would suggest that all too often in the last several decades that has been the case. We've had major contracting frauds against the federal government in the defense and healthcare industries. We've had a series of banking scandals that culminated in the savings and loan crisis. Congressman Miller made reference to the rampant misrepresentations and outright lies that were even called liar's loans that were at the core of the mortgage market in the run-up to the financial crisis of 2008. These kinds of events, episodes were not going on at fly-by-night firms or even small companies. These were actually members of the Fortune 500. And I think we're going to need a lot of careful thinking about exactly how to explain this. The argument I put forward in the book is that it's related not just to deregulation, but also to the rise of a culture within corporate America that's really been premised on short-term financial results at all costs, and the nature of executive compensation and compensation for middle managers, and also even people say who are bank managers at local branches who might be given rather powerful incentives to create accounts that don't exist or that nobody's authorized in order to meet their quotas. And that type of development, which was really something that emerged broadly in corporate America from the 1970s, even more so the 1980s onward, I think is a crucial dimension of why we've seen a larger scale of fraud, and also one that's hitting these really central corporations in our economy.
The financial crisis, the mortgage lending itself, with the people who are actually mortgage originators or brokers fit all those cultural stereotypes of the fly-by-night people. Part of that was the affinity fraud, but the people who were directing it and knew what was going on at that level. in the origination of mortgages, the making of mortgages, and the selling of the mortgages to investors. That was done by people who went to all the right schools, belonged to all the right clubs, have perfect social graces. They know which fork to use. They know
which lawyer to call.
They know which lawyer to call. They're in every way the people who you would want to associate yourself with and think well of you. And all the cultural cues said that those are the people who in America who are ethical. They weren't ethical. In fact, they were pretty much crooks. And we need to get past that. It's deeply ingrained in our culture of who we think of as being the better people, the ethical people, and the people who are not. You mentioned the Richard Whitney in the book just once, but you don't mention later what later happened with him. Richard Whitney was the president of the New York Stock Exchange, and the early newsreels in the crash and then at the beginning of the New Deal. In the early newsreels of the New Deal, he is a spokesman for Wall Street, saying that the securities laws are overreaching, they're unnecessary, and he was the perfect picture of a patrician. Everything you think of as a patrician. He looked like he comes straight out of Trading Places. You know, the movie with Eddie Murphy
Mortimer.
and Mortimer, yeah. The perfect patrician. And then as now, I assume all of the cultural cues in society was someone who was very trustworthy. He was indicted and convicted and served an active prison sentence for embezzlement. And I think that incident actually was a big part of why the New Deal was able to get their reforms through, is because that incident, his conviction for embezzlement from his stock firm, I think undermined the credibility of our patrician class and made Americans realize that, yes, we do need to regulate Wall Street.
And it was even worse because he was the trustee for the New York Yacht Club, which actually provided money to widows and orphans.
Right.
And he embezzled from them as well. On all of this was basically, this is actually another common tale in fraud. He got in over his head with some trades. He wanted to cover it up. He's just going to borrow the money for a little while and make it good, make other trades which will enable him to backfill the losses. Well, that only craters further into the hole, and there's no way out. But you're absolutely right. That prosecution, very clear evidence, broke the unwillingness of many people on Wall Street to actually engage with financial regulation.
And we never really had that in this. I mean, we could have, but we never really had that in the financial crisis. We didn't have anything like the Pecora Commission. We didn't have anything like the indictment and conviction of Richard Whitney. We didn't have anything by government that pointed fingers at who had actually done criminal or at least blameworthy things. And I think that part of that was the people in government didn't want to do it and didn't want much more ambitious reforms than what we got.
And it points as well to what obtained, I think, for several decades after the 1930s, which was not the coziest relationship in every moment between corporate America and the regulatory state around issues of investor and consumer protection, but a more productive set of discussions and constructive kinds of engagements rather than outright antagonism or an effort to sort of make sure that the regulatory environment was as minimal as possible, which has been something I think that we've seen in more recent decades.
Eddie Murphy and Dan Aykroyd were the...
Yes.
I'm wondering whether we should open it up to questions from the audience?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Yeah, there we go. So I think we've sort of been dancing around a little bit, but perhaps the panel could comment on the co-opting of the regulatory environment and scheme by campaign finance contributions, drive to deregulation, the repeal of the the division between investment banking and
Why
and
does
regular
everybody expects me to answer that question?
No, I said the panel. I said the panel.
So I'll make one comment, but then I'll leave it maybe for Congressman Miller to add on there. In this arena of investor and consumer protection, often the era of deregulation has meant not so much uprooting rules, regulations, institutions, agencies, as in other domains of policymaking. It's been more a disinclination to put in rules of the road with new kinds of markets like derivatives, financial derivatives, in the face of proposals to do so out of concerns for things like misrepresentation and the potential destabilization of the financial system. So that's one thing it's meant. And the other has been a mix of appointing people to regulatory agencies who are disinclined to have really stringent enforcement postures and a cutting of enforcement budgets. So there are fewer cops on the street overseeing what's going on in given markets. Now the question of what the role of campaign contributions is to that, I will leave for commentary to Congressman Miller.
There are friends I have this debate with frequently. The role of ideology or political philosophy, or as I more frequently call it, dogma, of not regulation, the market will take care of it all, versus the influence simply of money. And I don't think many people actually look in the mirror every day and think, I'm going to, I'm a crook. I am going to use my position. They do convince themselves that there's some broader public good by the position they're taking, but I think Sinclair Lewis said it's hard to convince a man of something that his salary depends upon not believing or not understanding. It's hard to make a man understand something that his livelihood depends upon not understanding. That was Sinclair Lewis, wasn't it?
There was a reference to food in the stomach in there as well.
Okay. But it's hard to get a politician to understand something that his campaign budget requires they not understand. So it's hard not to notice the confluence of self-interest and dogma. The dogma does explain doing what you're doing. It does justify doing what you're doing, but the dogma does frequently believing the dogma requires that you ignore how life works. Like you really think someone is going to sit and read all of their mortgage documents, and sit and read all their insurance contracts, and sit and read all their mutual fund contract or statement or whatever. And that there is this equality of information and bargaining power that makes a market work. So you can rely upon market forces, because market forces will work when there is enormous differences in information and enormous differences in economic power.
And of course, if you rely on market forces, it only creates new kinds of potential for deception. So if you rely on accounting, well, then you're reliant on the accountants being honest. And if their incentives get skewed, then you've got a new set of problems.
Well, and let me just throw out as well on this topic that you'll see different approaches by different agencies as well, and sometimes these issues can be complicated. The states and state attorney general's offices, even back before the financial crisis hit, were doing a lot, taking a lot of action in the predatory loan space and trying to get federal authorities to do more. And some of the battles we had to fight were that the OCC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, was always trying to preempt us. And I can't really speak to their motivations. They would always talk about, safety of the banking system and everything, but they were both not doing a whole lot in terms of consumer protection and trying to prevent others who were trying to take consumer protection action from doing anything. And so, they are very different approaches among different agencies, and that will happen.
Please.
I have some perspective on the last 40 or 50 years. In the mid-'60s, I was a wet behind the ears young attorney on Wall Street. There were a couple of things that I think have changed since then. The New Deal was accepted as a fact. People didn't like it. They would complain that we are the most regulated industry, but it was accepted. The other thing that has clearly changed very much is that the Securities and Exchange Commission was considered the blue ribbon or gold standard of regulation. I haven't read your book, so I don't know if you've mentioned anything like that, but it understood that it had two mandates, and those mandates were not in conflict. They were actually worked together. One was to keep the capital markets open and thriving, and the other mandate was to protect the investors, which some people will say, well, you can't do one without the other, but in fact they were very good at doing both, walking that very fine line in making sure. Now their philosophy, someone mentioned disclosure, and as I'm sure you know, that the SEC philosophy, or its dictate, was disclosure rather than you don't do merit regulation and say we won't let this. Yeah, and in fact, in theory, I never heard it happen, but the theory was that if somebody tried to sell interest in a trash pile on the grounds that there may be gold in it, as long as they disclosed everything and said we don't have any reason to believe there is any gold in there, it was perfectly all right. But on the disclosure, I still have some of the prospectuses that I worked on then, and they were about this thick. Now they're this thick. Now, it's not unusual for them to be that thick. And like you say, that's a lot of material to try to go through, and unless analysts wade through it and then comment on it and say, recommend what they think ought to be done, it is just overwhelming.
So just a couple of quick reflections. You're absolutely right. And part of the backdrop for that acceptance was the depth of the Great Depression. There was a capital strike in the early 1930s. There were no deals happening. There was almost no market to be had, even in the secondary market either. And there's no livelihood without a degree of sufficient degree of confidence to promote trade.
Excuse me, that reminded me of something, just an idea of the Depression. One of the older attorneys, one of the older attorneys in the firm, told me that he started practicing law on Wall Street in the early 20s, and he said by 27 or 28, he thought he had gotten the hang of it, that he knew how to do it. Said then the Depression hit, and all of a sudden, all those big, thick indentures and bond documents came back to haunt them, and they were having to scramble through them because both sides were fighting over who should get what. And before that, they were ground out by routine, just as I think happened during the recent trend.
It is important to keep in mind, though, that there's a little bit of a process of generational amnesia that can happen. And so when the Great Depression is 30, 40 years before, there are fewer people like that individual who were there and remembered it and can communicate just what it was like. And other problems come into view. In the 1970s, 1980s, there was foreign competition in the securities markets in a way that had not obtained before. And so people are concerned about New York losing ground to London if the regulatory rules are too stringent. And so, I mean, I think there are, it's a complicated story as to why there was a movement away from that, but there absolutely was at the SEC. By the 80s, 90s, 2000s, the goals that are really shaping the trade-offs within the agency about how they should handle particular issues tilted in a direction away from investor protection.
And if I could add to what you said, Ed, and this, I'll put in a plug for this is why we need history to combat that generational amnesia. I mean, the example to me is someone already mentioned in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, we eliminated the barrier between investment and commercial banking, the Glass-Steagall Act. Now, when that was lifted, I'm willing to bet 99% of the American public had no idea what the heck the Glass-Steagall Act was, including many attorneys, maybe even some bankers for all I know. But I can remember talking to 3 or 4 of my colleagues that day. We actually were in the hallway, and we all said, no one knows what this law is, but this is a really bad idea. This country will, I mean, I hate to say this, I was probably wrong about every other prediction I made as a historian, but I will tell you that day, literally, 3 or 4 of us said, nothing good is going to come of this. There was actually a good reason why this was passed in the mid-30s, and there's no reason to lift it, but there was this incredible amnesia. The Depression's long gone. We can never have another Depression. Of course it can't happen, that sort of thing. Housing prices never go down, all of these sort of shibboleths that were out there.
So that's a really nice example because the Fed predicated its modeling of derivatives in the mortgage market on the presumption that was the case, because the instruments, the financial instruments, had not gone back before the early 1980s, so that's as far back as you needed to look for data. As if the 1930s and what happened to the housing markets then was irrelevant to the discussion.
Right.
Back in the back, and you asked me to stand. The 3 biggest frauds we've seen recently are Volkswagen, Wells Fargo, and don't jump out of your seats, UNC Chapel Hill academic fraud as far as publicity. But I'm wondering how many large organizations have somebody maybe on a vice presidential level that their job is only one thing. They report to the president or the chairman of the board, and they have more or less freedom to question anything that corporation is doing, and their role would be protect the customer, the student. I think you get the gist. In other words, that he might get fired because he stirs up too much stuff, but the many big corporations have like a hired gun for the consumer or the client.
Well, I mean, I think it's really important not to suggest that all corporations are dishonest, because I don't think it's true. And obviously corporations with hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people working within them are going to have a lot of, even those that engage in marketing practices that we might want to question, are filled with many deeply people with deep integrity who are disinclined to engage in that type of behavior. And you're right. There are now right across corporate America efforts. Now, it's not just one person. There are entire ethics and compliance units within almost every large corporation that has the role of thinking hard about what kinds of activities are going on within the corporation and reporting their whistleblowing mechanisms within corporations. Many of these things are in response to scandals. and their impact goes beyond just the specific company often. So when there's a healthcare scandal, it tends to reshape the whole industry in the way they do things, not just an individual corporation.
I think it's a great question. I think part of what ultimately needs to happen, and Ed is right, there are a lot of companies that have ethics officers, or in theory the general counsel could serve that role to a certain extent, or someone else could serve that role, but there's got to be a culture within the company that it's acceptable to question something, or it's acceptable to come forward when you see something that's improper. And it's somewhat shocking that in some of these situations, some of them you mentioned, like Volkswagen, it's shocking, I think, in some ways, that no one came forward within the company and disclosed that that was going on. It took an independent tester of the emissions to almost randomly, it wasn't even the federal government that discovered it, as I understand it. And so it's really, I think the culture needs to change, and people within the companies need to be willing to question things and need to feel like they can come forward and point it out when something has happened that's wrong.
And that means it needs to come from the top. If it doesn't, and you have that vice president or the ethics and compliance office, it's just box checking.
Before I got to Congress, the congressional response to Enron and WorldCom and maybe some other such scandals was Sarbanes-Oxley. And one of the purposes of Sarbanes-Oxley was to make sure things did get to the CEO's desk. The CEO had to sign on with criminal penalties if he signed it incorrectly or without, not in good faith, without a good faith inquiry into the truthfulness. Certain representations every quarter. When Jamie Dimon, CEO of JP Chase, testified before the House Financial Services Committee on the London whale debacle, he really laid into their risk controls, that they just did not have good risk controls in place, and they were going to fix that. And I asked, but just a month before this, you signed a quarterly certification required by law with criminal penalties that you had adequate risk controls in place. I don't remember doing that. I don't remember that discussion. Well, tell me what you do generally. Tell me what your practice is. How do you go about those? What do you do every quarter when it's time to sign those? Do you call in your staff? Do they write you memos? Do they sit and brief you orally? Gee, I can't, and behind him, all the rows of lawyers, JP Chase lawyers, were having, at the very least, facial tics because the questions were about things for which he had criminal liability. That was something Congress tried to do, to make sure it got to the CEO's desk, and with no apparent effect at all.
And let me say, too, sometimes companies do the right thing. We have had some companies come to our office and say, hey, I hate to tell you this, but we had someone make a mistake at our company, and there was a billing error, and we overbilled all these people, and we want to do the right thing and provide refunds to them, and you're the entity in the state that enforces unfair, deceptive trade practices, and we wanted to tell you about it and tell us what we can do to make it right. So that does happen sometimes, and we certainly like to see that, and we treat that situation differently from a situation where someone is aware of fraud and just sits on it and does nothing. We'd much rather have someone come forward and do the right thing when something like that happens.
And almost every anti-fraud reform has a business constituency that wants a playing field that's fair.
Right. Right, and we hear that too. We hear businesses say, hey, we want the playing field to be even. We want you to go after fraud. We don't want there to be a benefit for engaging in unfair behavior. We do hear that, and I think there's truth to that.
Well, and you bring that up in your book, Ed, and I think in some ways you're tapping into that scholarship on the progressive era that dates back 50 and 60 years, that there has always been a wing of the business community that sort of wants to play fair and actually welcomes certain, now, doesn't mean they welcome all reform, but they welcome certain ones if it keeps the really bad actors from undercutting them. I mean, here in the state right now, we're having this debate over classification of workers. I happen to be a labor historian, so this is on my radar. And just reading the newspapers, there do seem to be some employers that are like, we want these laws because I can't bid on a job because the guy treating workers illegally is undercutting me by 30%, and that's actually the percentage that he's skimming from the workers.
There isn't nearly enough of that now. That has been my personal experience. There's not nearly enough of it now, and there are a couple things. One is the dogma, the anti-regulation dogma, the anti-state dogma is pervasive, and everyone in business thinks they can't call for regulation, even if it's for doing something they aren't doing and they know is objectionable. It's almost genetically coded now among business leaders. And the second thing is, particularly with respect to national organizations, the people who are most active in the national organizations, who control the national organizations because they're the ones who are active, are the ones who are doing the bad stuff. The ones who are minding their own business, providing needed goods and services on a pretty honest basis, why are they going to spend a lot of time on a national, their national association? Why are they going to get really involved? Why are they going to give to the PAC? Why are they going to make sure they're on the executive committee or whatever else? And I think that has been a big part of the problem as well.
I think we have time for one more question. So,
okay. Well, we have an issue of not only deregulation, and of course now it's going to happen at warp speed, but we have a situation where the regulators are not effectively regulating either, and they're doing wink, wink, nod, nod. And I'll give a perfect example of that, and that's Reg Z, Truth in Lending. And I would dare say, and I've done a fair bit of research on this, I would dare say that everyone in this room that has a mortgage, that their mortgage, if it's a fixed rate mortgage, is not in compliance with Reg Z, Truth in Lending. And I spent many years trying to bring this to the attention of the Senate Banking Committee, and I was essentially told by the chairman of the Senate Banking Committee, if we insisted upon strict enforcement of this, you would upend the lending industry. So there's regulators not paying attention.
That was an issue raised earlier that I didn't comment on. But yes, there is a revolving door that is not just members of Congress becoming lobbyists. I have not done that. But between the Tony White Shoe establishment law firms and the regulatory agencies. And the result has been extraordinarily disappointing. They may be Democrats. They may check a lot of boxes the chairman of the FTC, who I think has just left, is a Latina. That's 2 boxes. She went to Harvard Law School and was a friend of Barack Obama's there. That's another 2 boxes. She, I'm sure, was a Democrat, but her only credential since law school, she may have been a clerk for a judge, but I think she had been a partner, an associate, and then a partner at a big law firm. Well, you kind of become part of the culture of that firm. And there's an assumption that your clients okay, maybe they did something a little wrong, but you know, boys will be boys, and it's what they're doing is really pretty useful, and the fees they're paying us are all they're paying us to do God's own work to defend them. And the result has been an unwillingness to take on a lot of the practices, and it's the SEC, CFTC. CFTC had some good leadership, I think, under Gary Gensler, but there have been some disappointments elsewhere. FTC, FCC, all these regulatory agencies that require 3 votes, they come from the same, they have the same resumes, and that resume means you are very smart. I mean, I think if you went to Harvard Law School and you did well there, you probably have a pretty high IQ, but you don't necessarily see the world through the eyes of anything other than the environment in which you've lived.
So my last comment, just very quickly at the end here, is that if you turn out to be right, if we're going to turn our back on a whole host of regulations about investor and consumer protection, we can expect to see more corporate scandals and an erosion of public confidence in the markets.
Well, thank you. On behalf of the panel, thank the audience too. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good discussion. Really good.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Hey, Lenny, how you doing? Good to see you.
Catch you before they leave.
If I can ask the gentleman.
Sure.